Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to the fourth webinar in the series brought to you by Strengthening the Heartland. We're really excited to have you today. It's a beautiful day outside, so again, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Before we get started, I'll have a few announcements for you. My name is Amber Leafstedt. I'm the director of this project. And I have a couple of reminders and announcements for you. First of all, as we go through the presentation today, you'll see that you do have a copy of a handout in the handouts panel that you can follow along with the presentation. You will also have the opportunity to ask questions at any time during the presentation in the chat box. And we'll hold those questions until the end of the webinar, and I will relay them to our speaker at that point. So please feel free to type those in at any point in the presentation, but we'll hold off with responding to those until the very end. Also, after we finish today, you will receive a link to complete a really short survey just to give us feedback on this presentation. If you joined us for previous presentations, it's the same survey that we always ask for, but we really appreciate your feedback individually on each presentation. So feel free to take that as many times as you attend a presentation. We've also linked that survey link into the chat box, so you'll have access to that as well. With that, I'm going to present our speaker for today. Again, another familiar face. You may recognize Amber Leafstedt from our presentation on addiction and the family. And today she's going to talk a little bit more specifically about adolescents. And this was actually another topic that people had requested. They enjoyed the family discussion, but a lot of people work specifically with youth, and so we thought it might be a good idea to focus in on our adolescent population. So welcome, Amber. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, guys. I hope I cover a lot that everybody was interested in regards to addiction and adolescence. I am by no means the best or the only expert, but I do have some years working with adolescents. I've worked inpatient at a high-intensity residential program, working mostly with adolescent girls for many years. And so I hope the information that we cover is helpful to you. The information is really not really targeted for any specific profession or individual, and I just really wanted to provide you guys with some general knowledge about addiction, about adolescence, and go from there. As Dr. Leafstedt mentioned, there will be time at the end to ask questions. I really hope you guys will take advantage of that time, just because I would like to answer any questions anybody might have about, what I learned from working with adolescents for such a period of time and working with them at like the highest residential you can go for addiction. So the agenda for today, really the purpose isn't something super detailed or specific. I really just wanted to be able to increase everybody's knowledge related to addiction and adolescence, and maybe just start with some basics. And just like last time, if you guys do identify something more specific that you would like more information on or a presentation on, please feel free to give us that feedback, and we can see what we can do. So what to expect? So first off, I want to touch on some myths surrounding adolescence and addictions. I think that there are a lot of different things that are misunderstood or assumed to be true when it is not, and so I really wanted to take some time to talk about some of those myths, and then really talk about what the truth of the situation is. I'm going to follow that up by talking about some trends and statistics, and just kind of looking at where we're at right now in regards to, what teens are using, is using up, is using down, and just kind of looking at that. Leading into some developmental implications. Teens are at that age where they're transitioning from being children to moving towards adulthood, and so I think there's some important aspects there that we need to be considerate of when we are working with or have teenagers in our life. Going to talk about some risk factors and protective factors in regards to things that put teens at risk or things that can help maybe keep them from those risks. Talk about some warning signs, some things to look out for if you are worried about your teenager or worried about some of the teens you see, and things that can clue us into maybe something is going on, and let us know that maybe we need to take some early preventative action. And then just kind of wrap up with what works. And in regards to what works, a lot of it is going to be based on my personal experience. That does not mean that other things that do work that aren't on the list aren't valid. They are, but really just wanted to highlight in my own experience and from the information that we talk about what I view as working with teenagers. Okay, so we're going to start with some myths. So the first myth that we're going to talk about is this idea that if we talk about substances with teenagers, that's going to make them want to try them. And this in and of itself is just a myth. And the fact of the matter is that it is important for us to have open and honest conversations with teenagers about alcohol and drugs, because they're going to get that information somewhere. And it's better for them to get that information from a reliable source, from a trusted source, and a source that they can hopefully ask questions, hopefully can have an open discourse about them, because it is far better for teenagers to get that information, or even preteens to get that information from a trusted source so that it's accurate. It talks about the harms. It allows them to talk about this. So prevention can be effective when it focuses on helping people develop the knowledge, attitudes, and skills they need to make good choices or change harmful behaviors. And it starts with an open conversation about the substances, their effects, and their risks. And so really, the truth of the matter is, it is better to talk to teens about drugs and alcohol and their effects and have them learn it through that rather than peers or other resources. So the second myth I want to talk about is the gateway drugs myth. And I'm sure all of us have heard this, that alcohol is a gateway drug. Marijuana is the biggest gateway drug. And basically the concept behind gateway drugs started in the 1970s when scientists suggested that experimenting with alcohol, tobacco, or marijuana during teenage years increased the risk of use to stronger illicit drugs. There was little scientific evidence for this, and there was, for many, many years, a lot of noise, a lot of public things that were going on about gateway drugs, that it just kind of became this pervasive myth of existing, even though there was evidence. Now, we are moving into a time where we're starting to question that there isn't a lot of scientific evidence for this, despite it being, one way or the other, and kind of looking at it, okay, was this just a scare tactic to try and keep kids away from those drugs? So the truth of the matter is there is no gateway drug. Whatever substance teens use for the first time have the risk of leading them to further use, abuse, or addiction. There have been many studies conducted. None proved that the use of mildly addictive substances led to the use of more highly addictive substances at any point in life. And let's see here. So like I said, this phrase was coined in the 1970s, the 1980s. And today we're starting to question it a little bit more. And with the huge opioid epidemic, we are starting to do more research into what causes this addiction, what leads up to this addiction. And a lot of that research is showing that it's not a gateway drug, that it isn't some one thing that they do that leads to it. And so really working towards debunking this theory and removing this myth. So the next one, the myth is only bad kids from bad families end up addicted. And the fact of the matter is this is a myth. Anybody can become addicted. Addiction is a disease of the brain, and everybody has a risk of becoming addicted if they use mood-altering substances. The only surefire way to avoid addiction is to not use them. And prevention work has been created in regards to improving people's knowledge of this, especially if anybody's heard of the Prime for Life, which is used in the state of South Dakota for prevention for underage teens or young adults who have had underage arrests or minor and consumptions and stuff like that. And this works on educating these young people in regards to the phases of addiction and the trigger point for addiction. And so within this framework, it talks about the fact that there are different factors that will determine whether or not somebody reaches their trigger point. And there are two separate factors that go into this equation. The first one is factors in which we cannot change, which are biological factors. So these are things like somebody who has family who are addicted. So we are put at a hereditary, a biological starting point based on that fact, and that's not something that we can change. We can't decide whether or not we have parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles who are addicts. So that in and of itself puts us at a certain point towards our trigger point. There are other things such as people who receive higher rewards neurologically and biologically from substances, that where they're that sensation seeking. Individuals who have this are at a higher risk because, as we know, addiction is a disease of the brain, and the aspects or the areas of the brain that are most involved in this are our reward centers, our pleasure centers that are tied into that. So somebody who is more susceptible to that is going to be at a higher risk. So the one part of this equation is the biological factors. And then the other part of that equation is choices. So the choices we make determine how high risk we are for moving towards that trigger point. And the more often that we're making those high risk choices, the faster and faster and the closer and closer we get to that trigger point. And so that's where it comes in with teenagers, is teaching them and talking to them about these high risk choices and about these things that can lead them. And having the understanding that it isn't just kids who are growing up in difficult situations. It isn't just kids who have hard stuff going on in their life. Any teenager who uses a substance, whether it's alcohol, marijuana, tobacco, is making a high-risk decision, right? And it can lead to more high-risk decisions that can ultimately lead to addiction. And the thing about a trigger point is nobody knows where their trigger point is. Nobody knows how close they are necessarily. And there's no way for us to map out or determine exactly when it's going to happen. It's just the more often that we make those high-risk choices, the higher the chances are of reaching that trigger point. So the truth of the matter is, addiction can affect anyone regardless of race, gender, socioeconomic status, or what their family life is like. Okay, so this next myth is the idea that teens are safer drinking at home with their friends in, under the supervision of parents than out drinking who knows where we don't know where they're at, where maybe they're not safe. And this, I feel, and it might just be my personal opinion, that this is often a myth that we experience in the Midwest, that, we don't want them out at, the field parties and stuff like that. So we're just going to let them do it here where we can watch them. And the truth is that this is called social hosting, and it is a dangerous myth about safe underage drinking. And that's kind of an oxymoron in itself. There is not safe underage drinking. It is always going to be risky. And so this is social hosting. It is different from the practice of serving small amounts of alcohol to your own children during family events, holidays, or through religious practices and those type of things. Social hosting is when parents host parties for their kids and their friends and provide alcohol and almost encourage this use in what they mistakenly are assuming is a safe environment or a safe way. And in fact, 28 states have laws prohibiting social hosting, and many other places have established their own regulations. So just in this area, South Dakota does have laws related to social hosting. Other areas in this, or other states in this area, such as Minnesota, North Dakota, and Iowa, do not currently have state criminal statutes, that address social hosting. However, some communities may have their own local ordinances on social hosting that can include fines and other penalties. And so I think sometimes parents are under the assumption that teens are going to drink, teens are going to use, so I want them to be safe. And that's where it kind of leads into our next myth, is that all teens are going to use at some point. And so I want to keep them safe, or why worry about it? They're going to try it out, they're going to experiment. That's what teenagers do. But the truth of the matter is, not all teens will experiment with substances. And even if they did, it's going to still be important to address this with them and not encourage this behavior. In just a little bit, we're going to be talking about some more recent trends with adolescents and substance use. But here, I really just want to emphasize the point that not all adolescents will try substances or even abuse substances. Oftentimes, this thinking of everybody is doing it is also in teenagers' heads, and can kind of lead to that pressure of wanting to fit in, or the only thing to do is to drink and use. I can't tell you how many even adults that I interview for assessments, and we talk about, well, you know, what do you do? Well, the only thing to do is drink. And so it's really that myth of this is the only thing to do, and all teenagers are going to use. But from trends and statistics, we know this is not true. The second point I want to cover here is that the danger of normalizing teen alcohol use and drug experimentation. The idea of teens the idea that teens are going to try it, so why worry? I think comes from this normalization that we see, this oversaturation in our media, in our movies, in songs, and all that, that this is what teenagers do. However, even experimentation can be risky. As I said before, everyone has a trigger point, and so these different factors inherently put them at risk. And so it is important for us to educate teens about drugs and alcohol, and as was stated about prevention, the whole point of prevention is to give them knowledge and skills so that they can make decisions. Because while it is a myth that every teen is going to try alcohol and drugs, it is not a myth that every teen is probably going to be exposed to alcohol and drugs. That is just kind of the state of our world, and especially alcohol is legal. I'm sure you can drive down a highway, an interstate, you're going to see ads for alcohol. You're going to have your local liquor stores. You see it on TV, Super Bowl ads. There's going to be exposure to, at the very least, alcohol, and more than likely other illicit substances. And so while it's not necessarily true that they're going to try it, it is true that they're going to eventually be exposed to it. And so it is important to give them accurate information, to allow them a space to be able to talk about it and to educate themselves about it, and be able to have the skills necessary to make that decision. Because as much as we would like to say, my kid would never do that, or oh, my kid knows better. Well, have you had that conversation? And the fact that we expect kids to be able to say no in those situations, but maybe we don't necessarily give them those skills, teach them how to do that. And that is where prevention in certain things can become very helpful, is that we are giving them those skills. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. So the final myth that we're going to touch on is that teenagers can't become addicted at such a young age. And this is just not true. And actually, the earlier teens use a substance, the greater their risk of addiction. And so addiction can affect anyone regardless of age, and the younger someone is when they use, the greater their risk of addiction. And so referring back to that myth from the last slide, it doesn't matter if you're white, if you're 17, if you're rich, everybody has a risk to addiction, and being young doesn't take that away from that risk. Okay, so what is the truth from all these myths? That we as parents, siblings, professionals, teachers, and society need to talk to kids about drugs and alcohol. And we need to do so in a way that is open and honest, and not in an attempt to scare them straight, to scare them into making good decisions. because we know that doesn't work. We've had plenty of programs that have attempted to prevent alcohol and drug use in this way, and they're not effective. And so we need to make sure that we are talking openly with them, and in a way that does not increase the stigmatization of this disease of drug and alcohol use, because the stigma associated with addiction often lead people to seek treatment and ask for help less and less. And so when we do talk about this stuff, we need to do so in a way that is factual, in a way that is non-shaming, because the other part of addiction is, yes, addiction is a part or is a disease of the brain, but a large aspect of addiction is shame. It is pervasive in that disease. It is pervasive in the struggle of addiction, and it is often that feeling of shame and the stigma that keeps people from talking to others about their struggles with addiction. It keeps them hidden, right? Addiction doesn't like to be in the light. Addiction likes to be hidden. It likes to be in the dark. And that's mostly fueled by that shame. And so if we can talk to teens, if we can talk to just even each other in a way about addiction, in a way about these struggles that does not increase that sense of shame, the higher the chances of somebody coming and talking honestly about those struggles are. Especially teenagers. When we get to the developmental tasks that we're going to be talking about, they're striving for that individuality. They're striving for that and formating, that formation of self. And so when we kind of throw that shame on there, if they're, having these struggles or acting in ways that they shouldn't, that's going to hinder that kind of progress. So knowing the warning signs and being able to identify a substance use disorder is one of the first steps that we can take in early intervention. So we're going to talk a little bit later about what those signs are, but I really wanted to touch on some of the stuff that we talked about. So talking early, often, and openly with youth is majorly important. So once again, so early. I know that there's a lot of sometimes backlash about wanting to talk to young kids, even before middle school or in middle school, about drugs and alcohol. That there's, once again, that concern that if we talk to them about it, they're going to want to go do it. But once again, the truth of the matter is, the earlier we can get them educated about it, the earlier we can get them this information, the better off we're going to be. And then talking with other parents and adults and seeking family support. So having conversations with each other, having conversations with the adults in children's lives about addiction, about the warning signs, being open and honest with each other so that we can have this discord about it in a way that, once again, isn't shameful, isn't stigmatizing. It is a reality that addiction is a disease, and we wouldn't shame somebody for having diabetes. We wouldn't shame somebody for having heart disease. And we would feel comfortable being able to have a conversation about what puts you at risk of developing those diseases. So it only makes sense that we would be able to start shifting in a way of talking about addiction with the people in our lives and with each other and with children in a way that is okay, preventative, and not shaming. And then modeling responsible behavior. So once again, parents or responsible people in children's lives might, under a mistaken assumption, make some really negative choices, such as the social hosting. And that's not modeling healthy behavior. But also, once again, how we talked about, kids are always going to be exposed to, at the very least, alcohol. A lot of adults drink alcohol, maybe socially, maybe not problematically, but your children and the people in your life and the kids in your life see that, right? They learn from that. And if they see family members, if they see adults in their life binge drinking, right? So having more than 3 drinks on any one occasion, which is technically binge drinking, right? That normalizes that behavior. If they see drunken behavior, if they see all of those things, it once again normalizes abusive behavior of substances. And that is a risk factor. And so having adults in people's lives modeling that healthy behavior, and also modeling the healthy behavior of being able to openly talk about this stuff. And then being involved in the teen's life. So knowing what's going on in teenagers' life, talking with them, having that open discourse with them, having some structure, some boundaries, that while yes, they're trying to become individuals, we're also continuing to be active in their lives. And then seeking professional treatment when needed. So being able to recognize the warning signs, being able to reach out. Almost all communities are going to have some form of behavioral health services or mental health services or addiction services. And these are all places in which you can go to get assessed, right? So if I'm noticing warning signs, I need to not ignore them. I need to not pretend like they're there, make excuses for them, or just shove it off as, oh, well, they're just experimenting, right? If I'm seeing warning signs, I need to take action. We need to take action. And so maybe seeking professional help, seeking support from the resources in your guys' area. Okay, so enough of me talking. We're going to watch a little video that will tell us a little bit more and talk a little bit more about substance use and abuse with teenagers. Can you hear that, Amber? Okay.
Understanding substance use and abuse. Misuse of substances like alcohol and drugs is a growing problem in the U.S., and teens and young adults are most at risk, with half of all new drug users being under the age of 18, and 1 in 5 high school students having abused prescription drugs. Additionally, 1/3 of high school students currently use alcohol, 23% use marijuana, and 22% use all forms of tobacco combined. Decision-making in teens involves a chemical called dopamine in the brain's reward center. Dopamine helps transmit signals in the brain that make people feel happy. The number of brain receptors interacting with dopamine is higher in adolescence than at any other time of life. That means that when a teen is exposed to a reward, such as a compliment, the reward center reacts more strongly than it would for an adult. Also, being with friends increases the sensitivity to rewards and makes the already sensitive reward system even more sensitive. Feeling rewards more strongly and responding more intensely to what peers may think means that there are biological reasons for why teens sometimes decide to do things with their friends that they would never do on their own. This can be positive by encouraging friends to take on new challenges, but it can also lead to dangerous decisions, such as drug and alcohol use. Drug use and abuse can contribute to harmful short and long-term health risks. In fact, drug abuse can have long-term effects on a developing teenage brain. MRI scans of the brain have shown that people who have been using drugs for a long time have a smaller prefrontal cortex than people who have not been using drugs. The prefrontal cortex is the area where decision-making occurs. Drug use can result in poor grades, memory loss, and social problems. A lot of us have an idea about what a person dependent on drugs looks like. However, anyone can suffer from this type of addiction. Addiction doesn't depend on income, job, age, race, or color. It is a disease of the brain that can happen to anyone. Drug dependency is when a person consumes alcohol or drugs regularly, despite the fact that it causes issues in their life and relationships with others. Get help if you need it. Encourage your friends to get help too. If you or someone you love is struggling with drug use or abuse, call 1-800-662-HELP or...
Okay, so that video had a lot of great information, and one part that I want to kind of touch on is some of that biological stuff they were talking about in regards to the brain. So it talked about the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobe and how that is a little bit different in teenagers and the reward system. So one of the very last areas of your brain to develop is your frontal lobe, and it's involved with decision making, and it is also one of the first areas that certain substances affect, including alcohol. And so when we take the information from the video, this information, it can kind of give us a little bit of an understanding as to why teens sometimes make such poor decisions. They are already working with a handicap, right? They don't have a fully developed brain. They have different interactions that are going on in their brain that they don't have control over. it is important for us to be mindful of these things when we are working with teenagers, or maybe even when we're becoming frustrated with the teenagers in our lives. While we may just want them to act like an adult, make good decisions, and we might not even understand why they're making the poor decisions that they are making, the truth of the matter is there might be some reasons for that, right? There are some biological developmental reasons why teenagers are poor decision makers. This is not to excuse behaviors. And simply the point I want to make is that when we can understand why someone might act in the way they do, or some reasons why, some things that might be impacting their behaviors, it gives us some empathy, a level of empathy and understanding. This does not mean an agreement, and nor should it in certain situations. We shouldn't just say, oh, well, they're teenagers, you know, they're going to do what they're going to do. But from that empathy, it makes it a lot easier for us to kind of approach teens with this unconditional positive regard, to understand that maybe they're trying their best, right? And they might just not be skillful enough to be able to do better than where they're at right then. And to really not look at the kid as a bad kid, but an individual who is struggling in the situation in which they are in, and that they need some help getting out of it. So we are going to get to some statistics here in just a moment, because I'm not sure how recent some of the information is from that video, and we are going to look at the most recent statistics that I found. But I want to make one last point before we move on to that slide. And it's in regard to the idea of us just wanting teenagers to act mature, or to just act right. We expect people who have not been taught skills to act skillfully. We ask that teens meet expectations, follow rules, cope, or do whatever it is that we are expecting them to do. But the truth of the matter is, a majority of them, or a majority of the time, we as parents, we as society, we as professionals have not taught them to do the skills in which we are asking them to do, right? How do we learn how to tie our shoes? Somebody teaches us. How do we learn to talk? So how do we learn how we're actually supposed to brush our teeth, how we're actually supposed to brush our hair? Somebody teaches us. We can start to teach them how to make these good choices and how to meet the expectations that are being set by them, by family, by society, by school, by whoever, right? We provide them the abilities that they need. Okay, so we are going to look at some of the statistics. The Monitoring the Future survey from 2017. You can see I have one of the graphs up there showing the percentage of students reporting any illicit drug use other than marijuana in the past year by grade. And you can see that it has been going down. So teens' use of most illegal drugs is down, in the exception of marijuana, which has stayed the same, as well as vaping is on the rise, and the use of inhalants increased slightly. So these are some of the results from the Monitoring the Future survey. This survey in 2017, more than 43,000 students from 8th, 10th, and 12th grade, and from 360 schools across the United States took this survey. The Monitoring the Future is an ongoing study of the behaviors, attitudes, and values of American secondary school students, college students, and young adults. Each year, a total of approximately 50,000 8th, 10th, and 12th grade students are surveyed. The 12th graders have been surveyed since about 1975, and the 8th and 10th graders have been surveyed since about 1991. In addition, annual follow-up questions are mailed to a sample of each graduating class for a number of years after their initial participation. The Monitoring the Future study has been funded under a series of investigator-initiated competing research grants from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which is a part of the National Institute of Health. And the MFT is conducted at the Survey Research Center Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. So here I probably could have thrown up a bunch of these charts. I could have I could sit here and read all these statistics to you, but that would be boring for me, and I feel like it'd probably be boring for you guys. I just wanted to make sure I gave you a little bit of information about what this survey is. All of the information is out there. It is easily accessible. If you are interested in knowing more about specific statistics for specific drugs, for specific age ranges, it is out there. But I did want to give an opportunity to hear a little bit more about those. So we're going to watch this quick video.
Well, this year we have very good news because overall we're observing that the pattern of drug use among teenagers in the United States is continuing to go down, and it's most notable, for example, in the case of opioid drugs. And this is, of course, of great interest because we're amidst of an opioid crisis. So there's been concern that teenagers would also be starting to take these drugs and suffer the consequences. But in fact, we're observing, for example, some of the lowest rates of opioid use that we have been monitoring through the survey. So that's very good news. But we're also seeing continued decreases in cigarette smoking that are at the lowest levels that we've ever seen. We're seeing decreases in the other illicit substances. The only area where we're not seeing decreases, and we had observed that last year, is marijuana. So that despite the fact that drug use is decreasing basically across most of the drugs, marijuana is quite stable. An area that we need to monitor very carefully is that more and more teenagers are using vaping devices in order to take drugs. Among 12th graders, the past year use of vaping is 27.8%. And now we're asking through the survey what substances are they vaping. And out of those, 18.8% of 12th graders reported that in the past year they vape nicotine. Why is this important? Because nicotine is addictive, and studies have shown that when teenagers start to vape nicotine, then they are at much higher risk of smoking tobacco, of transferring into combustible tobacco, which is of course associated with very negative medical effects. And to the extent that we do not know what is the nature, how well they know what they are taking, and how easy it is once you start vaping a flavor to transfer into the drug. These are behaviors that we need to look out very carefully.
Okay, so gave you some more information about some of those statistics. So basically for the past 3 years, many substances have held steady at the lowest levels of use since the survey's inception, or at least since the survey began asking about them. In some cases, usage has dropped to the lowest levels that it ever has before. Some of these substances at a historic low level include alcohol, cigarettes, heroin, prescription opioids, and MDMA, and methamphetamine, amphetamine, sedatives, and ketamine. But as she stated, there are some areas for concern, including vaping, which they are doing more and more research on. So it will be interesting to see what research and what statistics do come out in regards to vaping, as well as some of the prevention measures that are created in response to this increase in this risk that is happening. One thing I do want to take time to pause and note is that while we are showing a decline in teens' use of most substances, this does not mean that there are some teens who are out there who aren't going to use, because they are. We're not at zero. We are at low levels, but we're not at zero. So it is important for us to continue to have efforts in order to prevent, to arrest what is going on. And I also think it's important to note that while teens are more likely to abuse things such as cigarettes and marijuana and alcohol, it is not unheard of for teens to become addicted to and use things such as methamphetamine, opiates, and heroin. And so I think it's important for us not to kind of be lulled in this false sense of security that teens just don't do that we don't have to worry about them with that, because we do. And I think it's important for us as professionals, as adults, and as individuals to be mindful of that, and also continue to work towards implementing prevention measures, treatment measures, and different things that allow us to help individuals who either prevent individuals from becoming involved in those substances, or help individuals who unfortunately have found themselves involved with those substances. Okay, so moving on to some developmental implications. So just gonna kind of go through these pretty quick. We all grew up, we all kind of know some of these things, but we'll just do a little reminder, right? So Heading into teenage years, we're going to hit our growth spurt, early signs of hitting maturity. We're going to see us going through puberty, so we're going to have some primary sex characteristic changes, some secondary sex characteristic changes. We're also going to see some intellectual changes. So as we move from childhood to young adulthood, adolescence, we begin to think on a higher level than that of children. Essentially, we're able to deal with abstractions, test hypothesis, and see infinite possibilities. So social emotional. So once again, I've kind of referenced this. One of the most important tasks of adolescence is our search for identity. This also means that we are trying to achieve emotional independence from parents and other adults. We're really trying to become our own little people, right? And teenagers are stuck in this place of that in between. They're not children, but they're not adults. They're not adults, but they're not exactly children either. So they're at this transition phase that can be very, very difficult. And once again, peers are taking on a more important role versus parents at earlier stages of life. So why did I want to include this in the presentation? I'm a big believer in the biopsychosocial view of addiction, and so it would be foolish not to consider how a teenager's biological development may be impacting their risk for substance use as well as other struggles in their life. Adolescents are at a stage of development which can put them at significant risk. To touch on their shift in social needs and who is most important in their life, they move from mom and dad being their central role in their social and emotional existence to peers taking on that role. And if we recall what we learned from that video, at the same time developmentally peers are becoming more important, their reward centers of the brain are more strongly impacted and activated by peers. So it's kind of this double whammy. Teens are also trying to meet their developmental tasks, which include their search for identity and achieving emotional independence. These are not always easy tasks to achieve, and at the same time, teens are trying to discover and establish who they are. Their bodies are changing, and not only can this be distressing in the, oops, I totally skipped the next slide for no reason. It's fine. Not only can this be a cause for embarrassment and shame, but it also impacts them biologically with the hormones that are going on and different chemicals. And so the main point I want to make is that as adults, we need to acknowledge that teenagers have a lot going on that can impact their decision to try alcohol and drugs. Their emotional health, their behaviors, and even whether or not they become addicted. So it is not as simple as bad kids become addicts. It is not as simple as telling them to just stop it and act right. Because they have so much going on biologically, developmentally, socially, that it may be very difficult for them to just knock it off. Now, this is not a get out of jail free pass for teenagers to just act and be however they want to be, but I think as adults, as people who may be working professionally with these individuals, it is important for us to remember these things when we are helping adolescents, when we are dealing with adolescents. Because adolescence can be difficult and a struggle to work with. Almost every agency I've gone to, when I say, I want to work with teenagers, that's my favorite population, they almost immediately hand all the caseloads over. Because it's a difficult population to work with sometimes, but it can be very, very rewarding. And also it can be helpful when we can understand these things, because then we can understand their behavior, because behavior serves a purpose. And so we understand some of that stuff. Okay, so the next part that I wanted to talk about were risk factors and protective factors. So there are various risk factors and protective factors that go into whether or not somebody is at risk for substance use. Now, keep in mind, some of these things are most of these things on here are things that we can choose. Some of them are not, especially for the teens, but some, like having parents who use, that's not something they can change. But if we're the parent using, that's something that is in our control to change. So we're just going to touch on some of these. So associating with peers who are using substances immediately put our adolescent at risk, because once again, peers are becoming one of the most important people in their life. And once again, if we remember with the brain, having a genetic disposition, so that automatically puts them at risk. If they have a family member who has a history of addiction, they are at a greater risk for developing an addiction. Or impulse control. So this is kind of, once again, a double whammy for our adolescents, because the area of their brain that is responsible for decision making isn't necessarily fully online. And so we also know that having poor impulse control can put an individual at higher risk. Sensation seeking, so seeking those feel goods, those pleasurable rewards that we experience for substances. So mental health. So one thing I want to mention with mental health is that addiction as a disease is primary. So what that means is addiction is not caused by mental health disorders. It's not caused by anxiety. It's not caused by depression. It is not a symptom of these things. Addiction by itself is a primary disease, okay? But they often go hand in hand, right? You will often see substance use and mental health disorders together. But I think it's important to remember that the substance use isn't a symptom of these other things. So parent-child conflict, the more conflict that's going on in the home, the higher risk they have. Inadequate supervision and monitoring. So if we're not keeping track of what our teen is doing, where they're going, we're not having set rules and responsibilities. As much as teens might say they hate it, teens actually thrive in structure, and they do very well in knowing predictability and knowing what they can, what the expectations are. Substance use among parents and siblings put them at a higher risk. So are we normalizing substance use? Are we having it in the house all the time? Do we have it always accessible? Are we having a favorable attitude? So are we promoting binge drinking and things like that? One here I want to touch on is behavioral disengagement coping. So what that means is when we are having a difficult time, we disengage, right? So we run away from it, we shut down, we ignore, we try to block it out. And a lot of the times when people are using substances to cope, it's to escape that feeling, because these substances are mood altering. So I don't want to feel sad anymore, so I'm going to do this. And so people who are prone to that disengagement coping are at a higher risk of developing a addiction to those substances. So there's some other ones on there. I'm not going to touch on each and every one of those. We'll move on to the protective factors. So the thing about protective factor and risk factors is if they have risk factors, it's not a guarantee they're going to become addicted. But if they have protective factors, it's not a guarantee that they're not. These are just different things, different aspects that either, you know, put them at risk or kind of help to protect them. Having good peer relationships, peers that aren't promoting alcohol use, being engaged in school, as well as like with peers, athletics, employment, religion, or culture, kind of avoiding that isolation, having them engaged in different things. Want to touch on emotional self-regulation. So they're able to regulate themselves. They aren't having to seek outside things to regulate for them. They're not disengaging in their coping. The fact that they have physical and psychological safety. If you notice on there, the fact that schools have policies and practices that reduce bullying is a protective factor, right? So when kids are safe, when they are not fearing for their safety, their physical safety, their psychological safety, they're able to build that self-esteem, right? That is a protective factor for kids. Having those clear expectations, having structure, limit, rules, and then having coping skills, being able to problem solve. We're giving these kids the skills that they need in order to function, right? So those are some of those protective factors. Warning signs, so behavioral changes, right? So are they fighting more often? Are they changing their friend group? That is a big indicator, because if they have friends before who aren't approving of using, they're going to find friends who are. Right. And so if you're seeing a huge shift in your kid's friends group, or the kid you're working with says, you know, they're changing friends, that might be a risk factor. I also want to kind of do a little asterisk for this warning signs. There are other explanations for a lot of these warning signs, but they're little red flags for us that are letting us know that we need to do some investigating, right? It might be, maybe they just had a really bad fight with their friends and that's why they're changing friends, or it might be something else. Once again, it's that engagement, being involved in that teen's life, that we are noticing these things, we are engaging, and we are investigating what they're telling us. So there might be psychological changes, mood swings, maybe they're being more manipulative and deceitful, changes in their attitude and behavior, health changes. Are they not sleeping as often? Are their eating habits changing, right? Are they not taking care of themselves? Bloodshot eyes, not showering, stuff like that. And then some other stuff, if you're finding bongs in your house, that's probably a pretty big warning sign. So finding paraphernalia, different things for use, our medications going missing, right? Our resources or cash, or even finding drugs, right? These are all warning signs. And once again, if we reference from before, when we notice these warning signs, we need to seek help. We need to not make excuses for them. We need to not, push it off as just experimenting. We need to evaluate what's going on and determine what needs to happen. Okay, so what works? So once again, just want to emphasize, this is very much from my opinion and from my experience in my education working with teenagers. Being open and honest with them about drugs and alcohol, right? So we need to give them that information. Ultimately, they're going to have to make those decisions for themselves, and it's better for them to have the information, accurate information needed in order to make those decisions. Having it be an open conversation, not a conversation that they're going to be judged, not a conversation that they're going to feel as if they're going to get in trouble for asking these questions or talking about these things. We're not shaming them for having these questions or thinking about using, right? We have an open conversation about why they're thinking about that. Give them the information about why that's a risk for them, and hope that you guys can have a good conversation about why that maybe is not a good decision for them. So that really leads into that unconditional positive regard, right? So we're not shaming them. We're not putting that stigma on there, right? We're letting them know that we think they're worthwhile, they're good in and of themselves, that it is not based on conditions, and that we are treating them as a person, the person that they're becoming, and that we are not treating them as children, because they're not children. They're not adults, but they're not children, and really respecting that developmental task, that they are striving for that personal identity, right? They're striving for independence, and recognizing them as that person that they are, and treating them with that dignity and respect as an individual. But we also need to set consistent boundaries with them, right? So yes, they need to be their own individual. Yes, they're striving to kind of become their own person, but they need boundaries. They need expectations, but they need to be clear, and they need to be consistent. They need to not waver. They need to not be different based on what I'm feeling that day. They always need to be the same, and they need to be clear. Finally, getting support. So if something is going on, if it is a struggle, if all of these things you are trying are not working, don't keep trying the same. Don't keep doing the same thing over and over, expecting to get a different result. Get support. Reach out. Talk to people. What resources are available in your area? Who can you tap into? Utilize the school. Utilize community mental health. Utilize family. Right? There are helplines. Right? There are supports and resources in your area, whether you're a teacher, a parent, a teen, whoever, in order to get that support and to get that help. Okay, so that is the information that I have, and want to open it up to you guys for questions. I hope you guys have some. Just want to reiterate, I'm not the end-all be-all for expertise with working with teenagers. I just know from my own experience working with them what does work, and I hope I can answer some of your guys' questions. So I'll throw it over to you, Amber, or Dr. Letcher.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Amber. That was great. Please feel free to enter any questions you might have. We do have a few more minutes. Amber's happy to answer those for you. I actually, as we wait, if people want to write some things down, I wondered if you had experience working with certain programs for youth, or if there's any that you really liked and would recommend seeking out.
So I don't know if this is necessarily a program, but a form of therapy. I have found that DBT works really, really well with teenagers, just because it really hones in on that self-validation. It really hones in on being mindful, right? Being mindful, as well as that emotional regulation. Because once again, teens are going through a lot in that time. There's all sorts of chemicals going on. And so being able to teach them DBT, a lot of it is about skills training, teaching them how to do things like how to get their own way. So there's specific skills to teach them, how do I have a conversation with somebody to try to get my way in a way that's not manipulative, that is not deceitful, that is not aggressive, right? So even simply breaking down skills like that, I have found is really, really helpful for them, because they're almost basic life skills of how do I maintain a relationship, stuff like that, as well as like I mentioned, the Prime for Life. That's a good educational prevention system offered through the state of South Dakota. And just, yeah, those are the two off the top of my head that have been helpful.
And for the non-clinical among us, what does DBT stand for? And
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Do you need to have specific training to deliver it?
Yeah. So DBT stands for dialectical behavioral therapy. So dialectics are like the black or white, stuff like that, and bringing them together of, well, it's gray. We got gray areas. And teens oftentimes have that. It's my way or the highway. You love me, you hate me. And so kind of learning how to see that I can both have a bad day and it's not the end of the world. And so that's what DBT stands for. And I would suggest having some form of knowledge about DBT if you're going to run like a DBT group. But there are plenty of self-help books out there. There are plenty of informational things that you can find to kind of learn about these topics, because mindfulness, that's not just a DBT thing. That exists in a lot of different stuff that is very helpful. And so I would encourage becoming knowledgeable about it before utilizing it, just so that you make sure that you're using it to its full potential. If you're going to be doing therapy with it, I would suggest getting training for it, just because yeah, that would be my suggestion. If you're going to use it therapeutically and clinically, get training. But if you're just wanting some helpful things, there are plenty of resources out there.
Perfect. I think that's always a question that we have is, are there resources out there? So I think those are two really good ones. And even if you don't have the background or the training, to ask your provider, do you offer those types of programs at your facility? I think that's a really good option. I also think you really nailed it when you said, teens, they're seeking independence and they're looking for their identity, but they do really thrive with routine. And so sometimes that can seem confusing as well. I want to give them a chance to be independent and make their own decisions to get that practice. But like you said, they still need those boundaries. They really benefit from those boundaries.
It's one of those dialects, right? We got to have both.
Exactly. Well, I'm not seeing questions in the question box. However, if after we're done here, if something comes to you, as right when I said that, let's see. What do you envision for marijuana? Since you mentioned it's not always a gateway drug, what are your feelings on it being legalized and diverting our attention to maybe stronger substances?
I can give you my personal and or professional opinion. I'll stick to professional. I think that oftentimes harm reduction is the best way to go with marijuana, just because going into this profession, I thought the hardest people the hardest people to treat would be meth, because meth is just, it takes so long, and the physical effects and the effects on the brain. But really, the ones that I've run into that are the most difficult are marijuana users, because there is just this culture around it. And so we can kind of start playing this devil's advocate thing. Is it as bad as this? Ultimately, marijuana is not risk-free. It isn't. It is not just a natural plant. And so sometimes being able to have open discord about it helps, where we are not going to these extremes, to the sides of legalize it, everybody should smoke it, or it's the worst thing possible. And so once again, being able to have that open discourse about, okay, talking to teens, what are your opinions about it? Present them with facts, because just telling them no, weed is wrong, they've been hearing that, right? That's not going to change their mind. So once again, it's important to give them information. And as far as public policy and stuff like that, I do feel like we need to have a lot of focus in on the opioid crisis, right? We have, I think right now we're at 130 people die every single day because of an opiate overdose. And so I do think that right now that is the more life-threatening situation in which we need to focus, and that marijuana can probably take a back seat for now.
Another question here. Do you know of alternative peer groups available in South Dakota for teens in recovery?
Unfortunately, South Dakota does not have a lot of options for teenagers. We don't have as much as, say, like Minnesota. Minnesota has quite a bit of stuff set up. So there's always the Boys and Girls Club has stuff that goes on. But as far as specific recovery groups, it would be local agencies, if they have enough teenagers to start one of their own, can do it, or even starting like life skill groups after school. That's not necessarily recovery, but that can be beneficial to any teenager to have these life skill groups. And you might even be able to get more kids invested in them if it's just life skills or whatever it is. And so unfortunately, no, South Dakota does not have a lot of options. My encouragement would be locally, work with your mental health centers, work with your schools, create those relationships so that you can get groups up and running, so that you can get programming up and running locally, so that you guys have those resources.
We've got one more question here. I'm sure, as you know, meth still remains a big problem in this area. We do talk a lot about the opioid epidemic because nationally it is such a concern, but our rates of meth are high here. Do you know of any successful harm reduction options for meth specifically?
Unfortunately, I don't think harm reduction is going to work for meth. I don't think there is a way to use meth in a way that isn't harmful. So as far as actual programming, I think for meth, the ultimate goal should always be abstinence. And I think most people who use meth would agree with that in some sense. But unfortunately, I don't know of any meth programs that are specifically to harm reduction. But in general, just harm reduction practices and conversations in and of themselves can be helpful, because basically harm reduction can kind of go hand in hand with like motivational interviewing, right, where you're meeting them where they're at, you're having this open dialogue, you're having this open discourse about their use, where you're not shaming them or telling them they're a bad person because they're using meth or because they're, you know, struggling with what they're struggling with. You talk about it, you have that open dialogue, you invite them, you pick up on those change statements that they make, and you enhance them till hopefully they get to a point where they're ready to take bigger steps, right? So maybe they're ready to go to inpatient, maybe they're ready to be involved in IOP services or intensive outpatient services, and get them to a point where they are ready and willing to accept help. So I wouldn't necessarily call them harm reduction, maybe more motivational interviewing tactics that you can take with them.
Wonderful. I don't see any more questions in here, but again, if something might come up later, we're happy to respond to those just either via email or some other source. Thank you so much, Amber, for sharing your experiences with us. We really appreciate it. You will again receive a follow-up email from this session with some survey links as well as the handout. And please feel free to share that email with anyone who might be interested. They can always access the recording. And we'll definitely be in touch with more webinars through this series. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day.
All right, thank you guys.